Hey again, folks, and welcome back to another Plowbender's Custom Creations. And today we're going to continue the trend of looking at what I call screen time customs that I've built. And this time we'll actually be stepping away from 1/64 scale for a little bit to take a look at a 1/87 scale custom that I've done, which is this HO scale 460 Rogers locomotive as it appeared in the movie Back to the Future Part 3. Now, one thing I wanted to mention about this model is that I did not build this for myself. Those of you who have seen my other videos on this channel are probably aware that I model in G scale, which is a fair bit bigger than HO. This model was actually commissioned by Eddie up in Michigan. I've done quite a few models for him in the past, and I think it was about 8 years ago actually, I first built this model and sent it back to him, but apparently it was damaged in shipping. And I actually opened it up in one of my fan mail unboxings I did 2 years ago to find that the model freewheeled, so something clearly came apart somewhere. But what you're looking at right now is the rebuilt model that I completed last year back in 2020. And I'll show you a little bit of what I've done to try to improve upon this and make it look even better than it did previously. Like I mentioned before, this particular locomotive appeared in Back to the Future Part 3, and in that movie it was depicted as Central Pacific Railroad number 131, which the real locomotive used was Sierra Railroad number 3, which many would argue has to be the most popular locomotive in Hollywood history, sometimes being referred to as the movie star locomotive. And I personally feel that number 3 is a Hollywood actress herself. She has appeared on many TV shows and in many movies, and I swear that if you've watched some of the older shows, particularly westerns, you have at one point probably seen this locomotive. Now, when it came to building this model, the first thing I'll say is that it uses the Tyco Rogers locomotive as a basis, which in my honest opinion is more of a toy rather than a model train. Granted, this was made back in the 1970s, I believe, by a toy manufacturer, although the quality just isn't there, and quite a bit of work was required to make the model look this good. But when I got this and started on the project, the first thing I did was tear the model completely apart to see what I had to work with, and the big concern was the fact that the chassis was freewheeling, which I figured something was either broken or stripped. But after opening up the model, I found that the motor just came loose, and it was a simple tighten and screw, and everything was good again. That's not where the story of the chassis ends, though. But onto the shell of the model, looking at it closely, I noticed that both the locomotive shell and the tender shell, the plastic had apparently reacted in some way to the original paint that I had used. And I suggested to Eddie that we may want to replace these, which he agreed, and we were able to locate replacement parts on eBay. But the chassis, on the other hand, it stayed the same. We didn't have to replace it, although I did suggest to Eddie that maybe we replace the motor in it, because the motor was pretty old, and I think it was on its way out to begin with. And I told Eddie I think we could just get a better quality motor to put in this unit, although quite a bit of work was required to fit a new motor. Eddie was able to find a spare in his parts box that he wanted me to use, and I managed to build a new gearbox or motor mount, whatever you want to call it, for the new motor to sit on and key into the drive gear for the chassis. I made that out of aluminum stock, similar to the one that I built for my HO scale lady model. And once that was in place and secured, tested the model to see that everything worked, and I was really impressed just how smoothly this unit performed after that new motor was installed. But with that done, I went ahead and painted the chassis in a semi-gloss and did the same thing with the wheels and the cylinders because they were part of the chassis as well. Now, the locomotive shell, another thing I wanted to mention with semi-gloss is Eddie suggested going that route because originally the model was just painted in gloss, which it looked too flashy. So Eddie suggested the semi-gloss, to try to dull it down a little bit. And the smoke box was actually painted in a flat black. Another advantage to the new locomotive shell that we got for this model is that it had a more accurate smokestack to the locomotive in the movie. So that was one advantage to going ahead and replacing this. But with the model painted in the semi-gloss and everything, I could begin reassembly and adding the finishing touches, which I kind of went all out with the cab, and I'll show you that here. Now, I put quite a bit of work into the cab of this model, and like I mentioned before, the original motor that was in this unit actually stuck out the back of the cab, and the boiler backhead detail was positioned just above the tender footplate. So doing that motor swap not only opened up the cab, but also opened up the possibility of detailing the cab, which after talking about that with Eddie, he agreed that was something he wanted to do. So the first thing that I did with this model is I had to install a floor in the cab because the motor sat there and there was no plastic to begin with. But another thing I did was I took the original boiler backhead detail and trimmed it down to where it sat just at the front of the cab like the real locomotive. Now, I wanted to look into putting seats in the model, and Eddie referenced the movie to see what they look like, and the seat that Doc was sitting on appeared to be made of plywood. So that was what I wanted to try and replicate. And I looked through my parts bin, also considered possibly scratch building the seats, but at the time I had recently got in some 1/64 scale Jeeps for parts and found that the seats that were in those looked to be the correct size, although they had sort of like a leather pattern to them. So to fix that, I just went in and filled the seats with putty and sanded them down, painted them, dirtied them up a bit, and they turned out pretty good. Went ahead and installed them in the model. Now, another little detail I added to the cab was Sierra Railroad number 3, at least in Back to the Future 3, was seen with sort of like a greenish, tealish interior color. So I went ahead and painted the inside of the cab in that color. And the last thing I did was I added some glass into some of the windows, which this glass was actually budget glass. I actually got this from the plastic that you'd get if you buy like die-cast cars or such. They come in the clear plastic packaging. And I mean, you can use that for windows and everything. I just recommend that you check and make sure it's not all scratched up. If you got something that's pristine, you know, it's going to look really good. Just go ahead and install that into the model. So when it came to the tender on this model, this is another part which required quite a bit of work, mainly to do with the wood load on this, because Eddie was really particular on how he wanted this to look. And when I got the model before, this was the wood load that came with it, and it's just made of plastic, doesn't really look that good, and I'd honestly just chuck it right in the trash, but for whatever reason, Eddie wants to keep that. But this wood load here, Eddie said that he wanted it to be made of real wood and look similar to what it did in the movie. So I sourced twigs from a crabapple tree in the front yard, and I basically cut these to 1/4 inch length, then cut them in half, and when it came to assembling them in the tender, I got a piece of cardstock as a base, and I painted this black to hide it, and then I spread a layer of glue on top of it, put the sticks down. I think I applied some more glue, put some more sticks down, and I think I applied maybe a 1/3 layer of glue and a 1/3 layer of sticks. And then once everything was on, I went back and used a glue water mixture to basically hold everything together. And the load here is a bit deceitful because the whole tender isn't full of wood, but that's honestly a good thing because it limits the amount of weight this model has to pull just with the tender. The only thing I am a little disappointed about with this wood load is on the locomotive in the movie, and I think even locomotives in real life, the wood loads were not just dumped into the tender, they were actually stacked, probably to get more wood on board. But I could have gone that route, it just would have taken longer. And even so, I think the way this looks is still impressive, especially considering what went into making it look like this. The last thing this model needed was the decals, and when I built this the first time, Eddie actually got decals from some guy who made them in Photoshop, and I just printed them out on some sticker paper and applied them to the model. But in my honest opinion, they really didn't look that good, so this time around, I wanted to go with water slide decals, and I can't remember who I got these ones from. If I do remember, I'll leave it in the video description, but I found these water slides, they have a nicer look to them. They just make the model look better. The only thing I wasn't happy with is that the decals around the domes here, those were undersized, and what I had to do is, for whatever reason, they included some extra decals, and I robbed the stripes from the extra decals just to get the whole way around these domes. So that was a bit of a complaint of mine, but other than that, all the other decals seem to go on without any issues, and I think the decals are what really brought this model to life and made it just look just like the locomotive from the movie. One small detail Eddie requested for this model was for it to have the bumper on the front of the locomotive that Doc built to basically push the DeLorean and get it up to 88 miles an hour. And it was relatively simple to build this. The framework itself is just made of basswood cut to size and glued together. And then the wheels, or more so tires, I actually sourced these from some of these plastic toy cars that you get out of the 50-cent vending machines back in the day. I had some spare wheels laying around, so I just went ahead and cut them away from the axles and glued them in place here on this bumper. And the back wheel, I actually had to cut that in half so it would fit over some of the cast detail on the front of the locomotive. But once all the bumper was together, I went back and dirtied it down a bit, aged the wood, and I originally mounted this with blue tack, and I noticed that it wasn't that good of a fit. It had a tendency to fall off, and Eddie suggested that I go ahead and try to mount this the same way that the front coupler mounts. Now, in the movie, what Doc did was he had the wood stuck through the cow catcher, and unfortunately that option wasn't available here because the cow catcher itself is just one solid cast piece. So I liked Eddie's idea of trying to mount this similar to the front coupler. So I glued a piece of styrene underneath the bumper here, ran it back to where the coupler mounted, and then basically installed the screw used for the coupler. And it's a lot sturdier to have that. And also it makes it easy to swap this out. If you just want to put the coupler back on the front, remove the screw, pull the bumper off, install the coupler, reinstall the screw, and you're ready to go. Now, if I bring in my custom DeLorean I built, and this is 1/64 scale, you can see how this looks with the locomotive. And Eddie does have this other Hot Wheels DeLorean that he wants me to re-gauge for this locomotive here. The only downside is that this isn't even gauged to this S-gauge track, so I don't know what Mattel was thinking when they made that. So that's going to wrap up looking at this custom HO scale Back to the Future locomotive. And I don't want to sound biased, but I'm just really impressed with how this model turned out. I think it's a vast improvement compared to the one I did how many years ago. But like anything, as time goes on, your skills improve, you get better. And I've done it in the past where I'll build a custom and then 4 or 5 years down the road, I'll tear it down and completely redo it. Just because, again, your skills get better, and I know I've come a long way with customizing in the 10 or so years I've been doing this. But Eddie and I, we do have plans to get the entire consist for this train. He did find the rolling stock for it. I just need to take time and do the model work and, you know, repaint the stock and everything. And I don't know if I'll show a video of that on this channel when I get it done. But in the case that Eddie does feature the entire consist on his channel, I'll be sure to leave a link in the video description. But again, I'm just really impressed with this model and really happy to finally have it done, and it'll be on its way back to Eddie here sometime this year. But anyways, that's going to be all for now. Feel free to let me know your thoughts on this model in the comments below. Duel is up next. I'll see you guys next time.